She pointed right at her, in front of 47 people. Celeste Harrington, champagne in hand, diamonds at her throat, laughter already forming at the corners of her perfect mouth, pointed directly at Amara Ellison, the housekeeper holding a silver tray near the doorway, and said it loud enough for every single person in that fitting room to hear. If Amara can fit into this dress, she can have my fiancé. The laughter hit the room like a wave. Cruel, delighted. The kind of laughter that doesn't apologize for itself. And Amara, 38 years old, plus size, black, wearing a gray uniform that had been washed so many times the color had faded at the elbows, stood completely still. Every eye in the room turned to watch what she would do next. If you've ever been laughed at in a room full of people who thought you couldn't fight back, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, challenge you, or make you feel something real, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Amara's story travels. Now let's go back to that room, because what happened next changed everything. The morning had started the way. All of Amara's mornings started at the Harrington estate too early, too quiet, and with the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. She had been awake since 4:30. Not because her alarm went off, because her daughter Destiny had a cough that kept cycling through the apartment like a bad loop, and every time Amara almost drifted off, she'd hear that small rattling sound from the next room, and her eyes would open again, automatically, like a reflex she hadn't chosen. Destiny was 9. She had her father's nose and Amara's stubbornness and an imagination so vivid that she narrated her own dreams out loud in her sleep. Amara would sometimes stand in the doorway of her daughter's room in the dark, just listening, thinking that no matter what the rest of the day brought, this small girl was the reason she kept showing up. Amara had dressed quietly, eaten half a piece of toast standing over the kitchen sink, and taken 2 buses to reach the Harrington estate by 6:15. She'd been doing that commute for 4 years. The first bus came every 45 minutes, the second when it felt like it. The estate itself sat behind a set of iron gates on the edge of Charleston Historic on the Edge District, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were so old they had plaques on the front, and the gardens were tended by people who were never invited inside. Amara had come to know the property. The way you come to know a place you'll never truly belong to. Every squeaking floorboard, every temperamental latch, every cabinet door in the kitchen that had to be lifted slightly before it would close right. She knew which bathroom faucet dripped and which window in the east wing let in a cold draft in January. She knew that Mrs. Harrington Celeste's mother, Vivian, took her coffee at exactly 7:15 and expected it in a white porcelain cup, not the ceramic mugs that sometimes wandered in from the back kitchen. She knew that Mr. Harrington said good morning to Amara every single day, which was more than she could say for most of the family. And she knew Celeste. She had known Celeste for 4 years, which was long enough to understand her completely, and short enough that Celeste still occasionally startled when Amara appeared in a room, as though she'd forgotten that a whole person worked in her house. Celeste Harrington was 29, beautiful in the effortless way that people who have always had access to beautiful things tend to be, and absolute convinced down to the marrow, that the world operated on a system in which she was always near the top. She wasn't malicious in the way that people plan cruelty. She was malicious in the worst way, casually, without thought, the way you swat a fly and move on. She had never learned Amara's last name. Amara had known this for 2 years. She'd discovered it accidentally, overhearing Celeste tell a friend on the phone that the heavy-set housekeeper, I can never remember her last name, had moved the throw pillows into the sitting room. Amara had been standing in the hallway outside, with a basket of folded linens, completely still, waiting to see if Celeste would remember. She didn't. Amara had carried the linens upstairs and put them away and gone on with her day. That was the job. Today was different, though. Today was the bridal fitting, a private affair that had somehow expanded into a social event, the way things did in families like the Harringtons. What had started as Celeste and her mother, and perhaps the maid of honor, had grown, over 3 weeks of phone calls, into something closer to a formal gathering. There were relatives from Atlanta and cousins, who'd driven up from Savannah, and bridesmaids who had their own bridesmaids, or so it seemed. 47 people, by the time they were all arranged in the east drawing room. The dressmaker, a slight nervous man named Mr. Aldrich, who spoke in very precise sentences and kept his tape measure looped around his neck like a talisman, had arrived at 9:30 with the gown in a garment bag so large it required 2 assistants to carry. Amara had watched them bring it in. She had watched from the kitchen doorway, holding a tray she was supposed to be loading with champagne flutes, and for just a moment, one small, involuntary moment, she had looked at that garment bag with something she didn't have a name for anymore. Something that used to live closer to the surface, back when she was 22 and sitting in a design studio in New York with fabric samples fanned out across a work table. She blinked it away. She loaded the tray. She went to work. By 11:15, the drawing room was crowded and warm and electric, with the specific energy of women gathered to celebrate one of their own. Someone had put on music, something soft and celebratory in the background. The champagne was flowing. There was a table of hors d'oeuvre that Amara moved through the room, replenishing at careful intervals. Quiet and invisible, the way good domestic work requires you to be. The gown, when it came out, was extraordinary. Amara knew that the moment she saw it. She didn't mean to look so carefully. She wasn't supposed to look at all. Her job was the champagne, the canapes, the small invisible maintenance of the event. But the gown was the kind of thing that demanded attention, whether you meant to give it or not. It was a crimson reception gown, not a traditional wedding white, which fit Celeste's personality exactly. She had never been interested in traditions that didn't serve her. The color was deep and saturated, the fabric a silk Duchess satin that caught the light like something lit from inside. The silhouette was dramatic, a fitted bodice, structured boning, a skirt that flared at exactly the right moment. The back was open, to just below the shoulder blades. It was, objectively, one of the most beautifully constructed garments Amara had seen in person in 15 years. And the moment she saw it, some part of her, a part she kept carefully locked away, started looking at it differently. Not as a guest would. Not with admiration. With the trained, involuntary assessments of someone who had spent 4 years learning how fabric behaved under tension. She noticed the seaming, noticed the way the bodice was constructed, noticed something at the waistline that made her pause for 1 second before she forced her attention back to the tray in her hands. She told herself it was nothing. She kept working. Celeste's entrance was theatrical in the way that everything Celeste did was theatrical. Not because she performed, but because she genuinely believed herself to be at the center of whatever room she occupied. She came down the main staircase in a robe, her hair pinned up, her expression already arranged into something radiant, and slightly bored at the same time. The room responded to her the way rooms full of people who depend on someone always respond, with applause, with exclamations, with a kind of performed delight that may or may not have been genuine. Vivian Harrington, Celeste's mother, a tall woman with the posture of someone who had once been told her back was her best feature and had never forgotten it, pressed her hands together and said, "Finally," and there was love in it, mixed with the particular impatience of a woman who had been planning this wedding in her head since Celeste was 11. The fitting began. Mr. Aldrich moved around Celeste with his pins and his tape measure, making tiny adjustments, murmuring in the professional shorthand of someone deeply invested in perfection. Celeste stood on the low-fitting platform, turning when asked to turn, lifting her arms when asked, occasionally issuing opinions about the sleeve, about the neckline, about whether the hem was sitting exactly right. Amara kept moving, tray to table to tray, refilling, retrieving, staying invisible. She passed close to the gown twice. Each time she looked. The second time, she stopped, only for a second, just long enough for her eyes to find what she'd noticed before the waistline seam, where the bodice met the skirt, something about the way it was sitting, something about the tension in the stitching. She leaned the smallest degree forward, and she saw it. There was a weakness in the construction. Not obvious, you'd never catch it glancing. But the boning inside the bodice was creating a point of concentrated stress at the side seam, right at the hip. The thread count at that juncture was insufficient for the weight of the skirt pulling against it. Under static conditions, in a fitting room, it would hold fine. It was holding fine right now. But dancing hours of dancing, the weight of celebration, the physics of movement, would find that weakness. And when it found it, it would not be quiet about what it discovered. Amara stepped back. She stood with her tray, and she thought about what she had just understood, and she thought about the fact that nobody in this room was going to see what she had just seen. And she thought about all the reasons she should say nothing. There were many reasons. She thought about all of them. She was still thinking when Celeste's voice, bright and carrying, cut through the room and settled directly on her. Amara. The way Celeste said her name always had a slight lift at the end. Not a question. More like a summons. Like calling a dog that was expected to come. Amara turned. Celeste was standing on the fitting platform in the crimson gown, one hand resting elegantly on her own hip, looking across the crowded room at Amara with an expression that was already halfway to amusement. The room had gone slightly quieter. People had begun to notice. "Come here a moment," Celeste said. "I want everyone to see something." Amara crossed the room. Her face was neutral. She'd had 4 years of practice making her face neutral. She stopped at a respectful distance. Close enough to hear, far enough to maintain the invisible boundary that domestic work required. Celeste tilted her head and looked at her the way Amara had seen people look at things they found privately funny. Then she looked at the assembled room, catching eyes with her cousin Brooke, who was already starting to smile in anticipation. "You know," Celeste said, pitching her voice for the room, "this dress cost more than most people's cars. Mr. Aldrich says it's a masterpiece." She glanced at Mr. Aldrich, who gave a slight, pained smile. "And I was just thinking." She paused. Let the pause build. Let the room lean into it. "If Amara can fit into this dress, she can have my fiancé." The room responded. It wasn't all-out laughter. It was worse than that. It was the scattered, uncomfortable kind. The laughter that happens when something is wrong, but the social current is too strong to swim against. Brooke laughed openly. 2 of the bridesmaids covered their mouths. Several of the older relatives looked away. Vivian Harrington's expression flickered, then settled into something carefully neutral. 47 people, and every single one of them was waiting to see what Amara would do. She was supposed to look at the floor. That was the expected move. Look at the floor. Absorb the moment. Make herself smaller. Move away. The graceful retreat of someone who knows their place. She looked at Celeste instead. Not with anger. Not with tears. With something quieter and considerably more dangerous than either of those things. "Fine," Amara said. "I'll try it on." The laughter stopped. Not gradually. All at once, like a switch. Mr. Aldrich made a small, involuntary sound somewhere between protest and alarm. Brooke's smile froze on her face and became something confused. Vivian Harrington's head turned very slowly toward her daughter. Celeste blinked. Just once. A rapid, involuntary blink that betrayed the fact that this was not the response she had prepared for. She started. "Unless the offer wasn't serious," Amara said. Her voice was level. Completely, unnervingly level. The room held its breath. Celeste recovered. She laughed. A shorter, sharper version of the laugh from before. "Of course it wasn't. It's obviously not going to." She gestured at Amara, a small, helpless gesture, the kind that said what she wouldn't say out loud. "Then you said something you didn't mean," Amara said. In front of everyone here, it landed. She watched it land. Watched something move through Celeste's expression, surprise, confusion. The first edge of something that might eventually become embarrassment. "It was a joke," Celeste said. "I know," Amara said. And she held Celeste's eyes for one more beat, just one beat longer than was comfortable, before she looked at the gown. And then she reached out and touched the fabric. Mr. Aldrich inhaled sharply. "Please don't." "I'm not going to damage it," Amara said quietly. Not unkindly, just with a certainty that made him stop talking. She turned the hem. She found the side seam. She pressed 2 fingers very gently along the line of boning beneath the fabric and ran them upward until she reached the waistline junction, and there she paused. She had known what she would find, but knowing and finding are different things. Under her fingers, the weakness announced itself clearly, the slight give in the thread, the way the fabric shifted fractionally under even this light pressure, the specific signature of a seam that was load-bearing weight it wasn't built to bear. She straightened up. The room was still silent. Celeste was watching her, with an expression that had moved past amusement and was now somewhere in the vicinity of uncertain. "What are you doing?" Celeste asked, less imperious now. more actual curiosity. There's a structural problem, Amara said, in the waist seam, right here. She indicated the location with 2 fingers, but did not touch the fabric again. The boning inside the bodice is creating a stress point at the junction with the skirt. The stitching at this point isn't strong enough to hold under extended movement. The room breathed. I don't... Celeste looked at Mr. Aldrich. Mr. Aldrich was staring at Amara with an expression she recognized. She'd received that expression before, in other rooms, in another life. It was the expression of someone in the presence of knowledge they hadn't expected to find where they were looking. He stepped forward. He bent close to the seam she had indicated. He pressed his own fingers against it, delicately, professionally. His face changed. How long, he said. To Amara, not to Celeste. Under static conditions, indefinitely, Amara said. Under 6 to 8 hours of dancing and movement, the seam will fail. The split will begin at the hip and propagate upward. She paused. Depending on the exact moment, it could be very visible. Mr. Aldrich made a sound that was mostly breath. Celeste looked between them. What are you? How do you? She turned fully to Amara. How do you know that? The room was waiting. Amara had kept the answer to this question put away for 4 years. She had kept it in the same place. She kept her portfolio sketches and her fabrics and the acceptance letter from the design program and the certificate of completion from her advanced couture construction course, the one she'd taken under. Marguerite Fontenot, who had trained in Paris and come back to New York to teach a total of 12 students in her career. Amara had been number 9. She had kept all of it in a box in the back of her closet, under Destiny's winter coats. She looked at Celeste Harrington, at this woman who had never learned her last name, who had just used her body to entertain a room full of people, and she made a decision, not a dramatic decision, not the kind with music under it, just a quiet choice, the kind that rearranges things. Before I came to work for your family, Amara said, I studied fashion design, couture construction specifically. I trained under Marguerite Fontenot for 2 years. The name hit the room differently, depending on who was listening. Mr. Aldrich stopped moving entirely. Fontenot, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she only ever 12 students, Amara said. Total. In her entire career. Celeste stared at her. She stopped. Started again. You're a fashion designer? I was, Amara said. I left. I had to. The room was so quiet that Amara could hear the music that had been playing in the background earlier. It had slowed to something instrumental and low, almost imperceptible. She could hear someone in the back of the room shift their weight. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her. Not the dismissive glance of employer to employee. Actually looked. And in that look was the beginning of something. Not understanding, not yet, but the first fractured awareness that there was something here she hadn't seen. Why didn't you ever say anything? Celeste asked. And for the first time, Amara heard something in her voice that wasn't performance. Something honest and slightly lost. Amara could have answered that question many ways. She could have been sharp. She could have been kind. She could have let the answer slide and moved on. Instead, she said the only true thing, because nobody ever asked. It sat in the air between them. It sat in the air between Amara and every person in that room, every person who had looked at the plus-size housekeeper, serving champagne and seen exactly what they'd expected to see, and nothing more. Vivian Harrington made a small sound. It might have been a breath. It might have been something caught in her throat. Brooke was not smiling anymore. Celeste was still looking at Amara, and now her expression was difficult to read. A layered, complicated thing made of embarrassment and something else. Something Amara hadn't seen on Celeste's face in 4 years of working in her house. Something that looked improbably like shame. Can you fix it? Celeste asked. Her voice was smaller than Amara had ever heard it. Amara looked at the gown. She looked at the waist seam she had diagnosed with her fingers, the hidden flaw that nobody in this room of 47 people, not the dressmaker, not the bridesmaids, not the woman wearing it, had been able to see. She looked at it the way she used to look at problems in the studio, not with emotion, with her hands, with the part of her brain that had been trained and tested and shaped by a woman who had told her, once on a rainy afternoon in a Manhattan workroom, that real couture knowledge wasn't about what you could make. It was about what you could see. She had seen it. She had always seen it. Yes, Amara said. I can fix it. The word settled into the room like something solid, something that had weight and edges and would not be moved. And in the silence that followed, Amara became, in some fundamental way that could not be undone, visible. Not the way the Harringtons had expected, not in gray uniform with a silver tray, but as herself whole, qualified, unhidden, standing exactly where she'd always been standing, waiting for someone to look. The word hung there. Yes, I can fix it. 3 words. And yet the room felt like it had been rearranged by them. Furniture shifted, walls moved 2 inches in every direction. Amara could feel the shift the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not comfortable, not clean, just real. Celeste hadn't moved from the fitting platform. She was still standing there in the crimson gown, one hand still resting on her hip from before, but the posture had changed in some subtle, wayless performance in it now. More just a woman standing, and not quite knowing what to do with her hands. Mr. Aldrich was crouched near the waistline seam, with a small flashlight he'd produced from his jacket pocket, murmuring to himself in the way craftsmen do when they're having a private argument with their own work. Nobody in the room was talking. That was the thing that struck Amara most, standing there with her tray still in her hands, because she hadn't put the tray down, hadn't thought to, and it was just sitting there like a prop from a scene she'd wandered out of. 47 people, and not one of them was making a sound. The music had stopped at some point. She didn't know when. Vivian Harrington broke it first. She stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the far window, and she moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who had spent decades calibrating exactly how much authority to put into each footstep. She was 61 years old, and she had the bearing of someone who considered retreat a personal failure. She stopped 3 feet from Amara and looked at her. Not unkindly, but with the assessing directness of a woman who had run a household for 30 years and believed she understood every person in it. Not Marguerite Fontenot, Vivienne said. Not a question. Testing the name in her mouth like checking its weight. Yes, ma'am, I've heard that name. Vivienne's eyes moved to the gown, then back to Amara. She trained couture workers. Very selectively. She did. And you studied under her. For 2 years. I completed the advanced construction course and the restoration program. Amara paused. I left New York in 2010. Something moved through Vivienne's expression. Not quite guilt, more like the look of someone revising an equation they'd believed was already solved. Why? Vivienne asked. My mother had a stroke. Amara said it without flinching. She'd had 14 years to practice saying it without flinching. She needed full-time care. I couldn't afford to stay in New York and pay for care and keep working in fashion at the same time. Those aren't careers that accommodate. She stopped herself, chose the word carefully. Interruption. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Behind her, Celeste hadn't moved. You've been working for us for 4 years, Vivienne said. Yes, ma'am. And you never mentioned any of this. Amara looked at her directly. No one asked about my background when I was hired, Mrs. Harrington. I was asked if I'd had references. I had references. It was not an accusation. It was a fact, stated plainly, with the edges left unsmoothed, and it hit harder for that. She could see it hit, could see Vivienne absorb it and file it, somewhere that would cost her something later. Vivienne turned to look at her daughter. Celeste had finally stepped down from the fitting platform. She was standing now on level ground, and somehow that made her look smaller. Or maybe it was just that the dynamic of the room had redistributed itself in a way that didn't automatically put her at the center. She was looking at Amara with an expression Amara had genuinely never seen on her face before. It was not contrite. Celeste was not built for contrition. Not yet, maybe not ever in the way the room might want. But it was uncertain. And for Celeste Harrington, uncertainty was a kind of nakedness. I didn't know, Celeste said. The words came out too quickly, which was how Amara knew they were at least partially true. I know you didn't, Amara said. Celeste stopped. Started again. Her jaw tightened slightly. It was supposed to be a joke. I know that too. Then Celeste's voice shifted, took on an edge that wasn't quite defensiveness, but was leaning toward it. Why make it into something it wasn't, Celeste? Vivienne's voice was quiet and absolute. Celeste stopped. In the silence, Brooke, who had been standing near the champagne table with her smile long since evaporated, cleared her throat and looked somewhere toward the middle distance. 2 of the bridesmaids exchanged a look. The relative from Atlanta, An older woman named Patricia, who had been a schoolteacher for 30 years and had the instincts to match, pressed her lips together and said nothing, which in this room was the loudest thing anyone could do. Mr. Aldrich stood up from his crouch beside the gown. "She's right," he said. Everyone looked at him. He addressed the room, but his eyes were on Amara. The seam at the left hip, the junction between the boning channel and the skirt attachment. He touched the spot without touching the fabric, his fingers hovering a quarter-inch away. "I missed it. I should not have missed it." He looked at Amara. "This is Fontenot-level diagnostic. You can see structural failure points under passive examination. She taught us to look for load distribution first," Amara said, "before anything else. Fabric tells you where the weight is going. You just have to know how to read it." Mr. Aldrich nodded slowly. Then he said, "How long has it been since you worked?" "In fashion?" Amara calculated. 15 years, 14 professionally. He absorbed that. "And you still, just from looking at it across a room." "I wasn't across the room when I saw it," Amara said. "I was close. I was serving champagne." Something in that sentence settled over the room like a thin layer of ash. Everyone in it had been holding a champagne glass that Amara had poured. Everyone in it had looked past her to get to the glass. Celeste looked down at her own hands. Her left hand, where the engagement ring sat an enormous cushion-cut stone that caught every available light in the room and threw it back doubled. She turned the ring once with her thumb. A small, private gesture that Amara suspected she didn't know she was making. "Can it be fixed before the wedding?" Celeste asked. "When is it?" Amara directed the question to Mr. Aldrich, because it seemed kinder than directing it to Celeste right now. 3 weeks Saturday, he said. "What's the thread count?" "On the primary seam," he told her. She did the math in her head, without appearing to do the math. The boning needs to be rerouted at the hip channel. The side seam needs to be opened, and the stress point redistributed across a wider junction. You'll need a French seam reinforcement at the waistline. She looked at the skirt. "The silk is Duchess satin," imported, Mr. Aldrich said. "From Lyon," Amara said. He blinked.
"Yes."
"You can't run it back through a machine. The finish will shear." She looked at Celeste. "It needs to be done by hand." "By hand," Celeste repeated. "Yes, how long?" Amara looked at the gown one more time. She looked at it the way a surgeon looks at a scan, not with feeling, but with the particular attention that comes from training so deep it becomes instinct. She thought about the evenings she had available. She thought about Destiny's school schedule and the early buses, and the fact that she had exactly one decent set of couture needles left from a kit she'd bought in 2009 and had never thrown away. She didn't ask herself why she hadn't thrown them away. 5 nights, she said. "If I have access to a proper workspace and the right materials." Celeste nodded, then stopped nodding, then said, "You would do this. After what I—" She didn't finish the sentence. "I would do it," Amara said. "But we should be clear about what this is. It's not forgiveness. It's work. I know how to do this work, and the dress needs to be done. Those are the only 2 facts that matter right now." Celeste flinched, just slightly, just enough. Vivian Harrington looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at Amara. "Whatever you need," she said. "Materials, workspace, time. Whatever you need, you'll have it." "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington." The room began to breathe again. Conversation started up at the edges, quiet, tentative, the resumption of normal social noise after something abnormal had passed through. People moved toward to the champagne table. The bridesmaids clustered together near the window. Brooke crossed the room to Celeste and said something low, and Celeste said something back, and whatever it was, it didn't look comfortable for either of them. Mr. Aldrich came to stand beside Amara. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the gown, which had been carefully hung back on its dress form by one of his assistants. "Fontenot's students don't just disappear," he said. Amara said nothing. "She would have remembered you." "She did, actually," Amara said. "She sent me a letter when I left. I still have it." He looked at her sideways. "What did it say?" Amara picked up her tray from where she'd finally set it down on the nearest surface. She couldn't have said when she'd done that. She said that some doors close from the outside, and that a woman with her hands and her eyes would always find her way back to her work. She straightened. "I never knew what to do with that." Mr. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Start tomorrow morning." She looked at him. "I'll be here," he said. "I want to see your technique on the French seam." It was not charity. She understood that instinctively. He was not offering her anything out of pity. He was a craftsman who had just discovered another craftsman and was responding the only way craftsmen do, which is with the urgent need to see the work. 7 o'clock, she said. 7, he agreed. She picked up her tray and went back to the business of the afternoon, because that was still her job. Nobody had changed that. The room was shifting around her in ways she could feel, but couldn't fully see yet. The way you can feel a current in water before you understand which direction it's pulling. That evening, after the last of the guests had filtered out and the drawing room had been returned to its normal order, Amara collected her bag from the back hall and put on her coat and stood for a moment in the kitchen, which was empty and fluorescent lit and smelled like the dish soap she'd used to clean the champagne flutes. Celeste appeared in the doorway. She was out of the gown, back in ordinary clothes. Expensive ordinary clothes, but ordinary. No jewelry except the ring. Her hair was down. She looked, without the event around her, like a person rather than a performance, and Amara was not sure she'd ever seen that before. "I want to apologize," Celeste said. "All right." Celeste came further into the kitchen. She seemed uncomfortable in it. It was Amara's territory. This room, and some people are uncomfortable when they realize they've entered someone else's territory without an invitation. "I've been thinking about what you said. About nobody asking." Amara waited. "I didn't know," Celeste said again. "I want to say that. I know it doesn't fix what I said, but I genuinely didn't know." "You didn't know," Amara agreed. "You also didn't ask." Celeste's jaw tightened. "I understand that." 4 years, Amara said. It came out more quietly than she intended. "I've been in your house for 4 years. I've cleaned the bathroom where you get sick when you're nervous, and I've pressed the shirt your fiancé left here the night before your engagement was announced, and I've folded the dress you wore to your grandmother's funeral." 4 years, Celeste. It was the first time she'd used her name without a title. She watched Celeste notice it. "You don't know my last name." The silence that followed had texture. Celeste opened her mouth, closed it. "Ellison," Amara said. "My name is Amara Ellison. My daughter's name is Destiny. She's 9. She has a cough right now that I'm hoping isn't going to turn into something bigger, and I've been trying to figure out for 3 weeks whether I can afford to take her to a specialist without putting my rent payment off." She stopped. Not because she was done, but because she had said enough. More than she'd meant to say. Celeste looked like she'd been handed something fragile and heavy, and wasn't sure she deserved to hold it. "Destiny," Celeste repeated. "Yes, that's its beautiful name. She's a beautiful kid." Amara picked up her bag. "I'll be here at 7 tomorrow to start on the gown. I'll need access to the sewing room on the 3rd floor. Of course, anything, and I'll need you to stay out of it while I'm working." She said it without heat. "Not because I'm not out of anything personal. I need to concentrate, and I can't concentrate with an audience." Celeste nodded. "Okay." Amara put on her coat. At the kitchen door, she paused. She didn't know why. She turned back. "The dress is extraordinary," she said. "Whoever designed it, the original construction is exceptional. This structural issue, it's a manufacturing error, not a design error." She looked at Celeste. "You chose well." Celeste was watching her with an expression Amara didn't have a clean name for. "Thank you," Celeste said. Amara walked out. The bus home was cold and mostly empty and smelled like the city at the end of a long day. Amara sat by the window and watched Charleston move past the glass, the lit storefronts, the old streets, the particular way the historic district's streetlights throw circles of amber on the pavement, and she let herself, for a few minutes, feel what she'd been holding at arm's length all day. It was grief, partly. It always was when she got too close to this. The grief of a life that had gone in one direction instead of another, and the unanswerables of what it would have looked like if it had been different. If her mother hadn't had the stroke, if she'd had someone to share the weight with, if she'd found a way to stay, she hadn't stayed. She'd come home, and she'd taken care of her mother, and she'd found work, and she'd had Destiny, who was her own category of thing. Not grief, not cost. Just Destiny, whole and specific, and worth every single thing. And she had put her sketches in a box, and her needles in the same box, and she had gone on. That was the word for it. She had gone on. And now a woman who had never learned her last name had accidentally handed her a $60,000 gown to repair, and Amara's hands were already remembering what her mind had been trying to forget. She got home at 8:15. Destiny was asleep on the couch, which meant the babysitter misses. Reyes had let her stay up too late again, and she'd passed out before making it to her room. Ampara stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at her 9 years old, small and sturdy, her hair coming loose from 2 braids that had survived most of the day, and felt the grief recede to wherever it went when there was something more important than grief in the room. She picked Destiny up heavier than she used to be, getting too old for this, but not tonight, and carried her to bed. She tucked her in. She sat on the edge of the mattress. Destiny made a small sound. The cough. Still there, but lighter. "Mama?" without opening her eyes. "Right here," Amara said. "Good day?" Amara thought about the fitting room, the laughter, the waist seam, Celeste's face when she understood, Mr. Aldrich's eyes when he heard the name Fontenot, the kitchen light and Celeste saying Destiny. "That's a beautiful name." "Interesting day," she said. Destiny made a satisfied sound and went back under. Amphara sat there for a while. Then she went to her own closet, and she pulled out a box from under the winter coats and she opened it. And she looked at what was inside. Her portfolio, sketches she'd made between 2004 and 2010, back when her hands moved with that particular confidence that comes from working every day. Pattern pieces, sample swatches in colors she'd sourced herself from markets she'd walked through on weekends. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, her couture needle kit, the one she'd bought in 2009 from a specialty supplier on West 37th Street. She unwrapped it. The needles were still perfect. That was the thing about good tools. They didn't degrade from sitting. They just waited. She held the case in her hands for a long moment. Then she closed it, set it on top of the portfolio, left it out where she could see it. She didn't sleep much. She wasn't surprised. By 6 the next morning, she was back on the bus, her needle kit in her bag alongside her lunch and her phone charger, and the piece of toast she'd eaten standing over the sink again. The sewing room on the 3rd floor of the Harrington estate was a large space with good northern light and a long work table that had clearly not been used for serious work in years. When Amara arrived at 5 to 7, Mr. Aldrich was already there, which she respected without saying so, because some things are better communicated by showing up than by commenting. He had laid out the gown on the work table and arranged a selection of materials, silks, threads, a range of needles, stabilizers. He'd done it the way a prepared person sets out a workspace, not ostentatiously, just practically. Ready. She set down her bag. She put on the light magnifying glasses she'd brought reading. Glasses didn't cut it for this kind of work. She looked at the seam she'd identified the previous day. "You'd open it here," Mr. Aldrich said, indicating a point. "No." She indicated a point 2 centimeters higher. "If you open it there, you're working within the failure zone. You need clean fabric on either side." She looked at him. "Did Fontenot teach you?" "I trained in Paris. Different school, but we had similar doctrine." He paused. "She was better than my teachers." Amara almost smiled. Almost. She picked up her first needle. She found the thread weight she needed from the materials he'd laid out. She bent over the seam, and something in her went quiet in a way that nothing else had ever quieted it. Not peace, exactly. More like the settling of a thing that had been vibrating at the wrong frequency for 15 years, finally finding its correct pitch. She worked. Mr. Aldrich watched her for the first 20 minutes without speaking, which was the right thing to do. Then he asked a technical question, a good one, and she answered it, and they went back and forth for a while in the language of the work, which is not really language at all, but a kind of mutual attention. At 9 o'clock, Celeste appeared in the doorway. She had said she would stay away. Amara heard her footsteps in the hall and felt them stop at the doorway and knew without turning that she was standing there, looking in, trying to be invisible in a house where she had never had to be invisible before. Amara kept working. After a moment, the footsteps retreated. By 11, she had the side seam opened, and the failure point exposed visible now to anyone. The inadequate thread count showing clearly under magnification, the boning channel misaligned by 3 millimeters that had been enough to compromise everything under load. "There it is," Mr. Aldrich said. "There it is," Amara agreed. She worked until 1, when she needed to stop to rest her eyes. Mr. Aldrich brought coffee from somewhere. She didn't ask where, he just appeared with 2 cups, and they sat in the good northern light of the sewing room and drank it without talking much. "What will you do after this?" he asked. She looked at him. After the gown, he said. She hadn't let herself think past the gown. That was the discipline. You don't look past the current problem when the current problem requires everything you have. I'll go back to my regular work, she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then that would be a waste. It sat between them. That's not your call, she said, without anger. No, he agreed. It's not. They finished the coffee. She went back to work. It was on the third day that it happened, the thing she should have seen coming and didn't, because she'd been so deep in the work that she'd stopped paying attention to the house around her. She came out of the sewing room just after noon to use the bathroom down the hall, and she heard voices below in the main foyer. Sharp ones. The kind of conversations that didn't start sharp but had worked its way there. She recognized Celeste's voice, and a voice she didn't recognize, male, low, with an accent from somewhere in the Carolina Midlands that she associated with old money and its particular brand of certainty. She should have gone straight back to the sewing room. She stood still in the hallway instead. Don't understand why she's up there, the male voice said. It's strange, Celeste. Having the housekeeper. She's not just the housekeeper, Preston. Preston, the fiancé. She'd never met him. He'd been away for most of the weeks she'd been working at the estate during the engagement. She's the help, Preston said. I'm sure she's capable. She trained under Marguerite Fontenot. Celeste's voice had something defensive in it, which surprised Amara. Do you know what that means? I don't. It means she's more qualified than anyone we could hire to fix this gown. It means Aldrich said himself he wouldn't trust the repair to anyone else. A pause. It means I made a mistake. You're being dramatic. I publicly humiliated her in front of 47 people. Celeste, and the worst part is that I didn't even think about it. I pointed at her, and I said something awful, and I didn't even have the excuse of being drunk or having an agenda. I was just thoughtless. I was just casually cruel. To a woman who has been working in this house for 4 years, and I didn't know her last name. Silence from Preston. Ellison, Celeste said. Her name is Amara Ellison. She has a 9-year-old daughter named Destiny. I want to do something about Destiny's doctor situation. You want to? Preston's voice shifted. What? She mentioned that her daughter needs to see a specialist, and she can't. Celeste, I really don't think it's appropriate to start involving yourself in the personal finances of the... Preston. Celeste's voice cut through his, with the particular precision of someone who has just made a decision and is done negotiating it. I'm not asking for your input on this. A long pause. I don't know who you're becoming, Preston said. Something about the way he said it. The flatness, the slight contempt under it made the hair on Amara's arms rise. Maybe I'm becoming somebody better, Celeste said. Amara moved very quietly back to the sewing room and closed the door. She sat at the work table and looked at the open seam of the gown and listened to her own heartbeat for a moment. Because something had just shifted in the architecture of this story she was living inside, and she was beginning to understand that what had started as a public humiliation in a fitting room had become something more entangled and more consequential than she had any plan for. The gown was not just a gown. Preston Whitmore. She'd learned his last name from overhearing Vivian on a phone call came to find her that afternoon. She heard his knock on the sewing room door and said, "Come in," without looking up, because she was at a delicate point in the seam reinforcement, and stopping was not an option. He came in and stood a few feet from the work table. She could see his shoes in her peripheral vision, expensive, recently polished, the kind of shoes that announced their price in their quietness. "You must be Samara," he said. "I am. Preston Whitmore." He paused, clearly expecting her to look up. She didn't. "Celeste's fiancé. I know who you are, Mr. Whitmore. A beat. She talks about you." Amara ran the needle through the silk. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to see the work," he said. He said it in the tone of someone who had manufactured a reason to come into a room. She'd heard that tone before in offices, in waiting rooms, in the particular interactions where someone needs to assess something they don't know how to ask about directly. He wasn't here to see the work. He was here to see her. She kept working. "It's very precise," he said after a moment of watching. "That's what couture is. Celeste says you studied in New York." "I did, and then came back here, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came a step closer to the work table. Not aggressively, but with the ease of a man who moved through spaces as though they belonged to him by default. "She's been different," he said. "Since this situation." Amara said nothing. She stopped, recalibrated. "She thinks she owes you something." "She doesn't owe me anything." Amara said. I'm doing a job. That's what I told her. She looked up then, deliberately. Let him have the full weight of her attention, which was considerable. Did you? She said. He met her eyes. He was handsome, in a way that was almost aggressive, square jaw, easy posture, the confidence of a man who had never been looked at and found wanting. He held her gaze without flinching, which told her he was smarter than she'd given him credit for, from the hallway conversation. I'm not the villain here, he said. I didn't say you were. The way you looked at me just now, I was looking at you because you were talking to me. She looked back at the gown. Is there something specific I can help you with, Mr. Whitmore? A long pause. She's called off 2 things this week, he said. Things we'd planned. Events. He paused. She says she's been thinking. That's a reasonable thing to be doing before a wedding, Amara said. His jaw shifted, just slightly. You know, he said, I think you're enjoying this. I'm enjoying the gown, she said. The rest of it has nothing to do with me. You're in the middle of my house. I'm in the middle of your fiancé's family's house, she said, doing a job I was asked to do. When it's finished, I'll leave, just like I do every day. He stood there for another 5 seconds. She counted them in her head, not looking at him, keeping her stitch count even. Then he left. She let out a breath she hadn't completely realized she'd been holding. That evening, before she packed up for the night, she looked at the progress on the gown. 3 days in, and the side seam was reinforced, the boning rerouted, the failure point now distributed across a junction that could hold 5 times the original load. 2 more nights, maybe 3 to complete the French seam and restore the exterior finish so it was invisible. She was going to make it perfect. Not for Celeste. Not against Preston. For the same reason she'd always done the work. Because a thing worth doing was worth the full weight of your ability. And anything less was a betrayal of what your hands were for. She was putting her needle kit away when Celeste appeared in the doorway again. She'd learned to knock now, or had decided to. She rapped twice on the doorframe and waited. Come in, Amara said. Celeste came in. She looked at the gown on the dress form, the open seams now reassembled in their first phase of restoration. She looked at it with something close to awe, which was not an expression Amara was accustomed to seeing on her. It doesn't even look touched, Celeste said. That's the point. Celeste nodded. Then Preston came to see you today. Amara folded the magnifying glasses into their case. He did. I didn't ask him to. I know. Celeste came further into the room. She sat, uninvited, on the chair near the window, which was either a breach of etiquette or the beginning of someone who was learning to take up space differently. Amara couldn't tell which. He thinks I'm having some kind of crisis, Celeste said, because of what happened at the fitting. Are you? Celeste thought about it with more seriousness than Amara expected. I think I'm just seeing things I wasn't seeing before. I don't know if that's a crisis or just being awake. Amara said nothing. He doesn't like that I want to help Destiny, Celeste said. With the specialist, Amara's hands went still. I didn't ask for that, she said carefully. I know you didn't. Celeste met her eyes. I'm offering. You can't use my daughter to manage your feelings about what happened. It came out more directly than she'd planned, and she watched Celeste absorb it, watched the slight recoil, the flash of something wounded, and then the longer beat where Celeste sat with it, instead of defending against it. You're right, Celeste said. That's your right. I hear that. A pause. But what if I want to do it anyway? Not to manage anything. Just because a kid needs to see a doctor. And I have the ability to make that happen. Amara looked at her for a long moment. I'll think about it, she said, which was more than she'd planned to give. Celeste nodded and stood. She moved toward the door, stopped at the threshold with her hand on the door frame. The same she'd stood outside for 3 days without coming through. Preston asked me to postpone the wedding, she said. Amara's hand stopped entirely. He says he needs more time. That thing's feel off. Celeste's voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when there's something underneath that you're not ready to let out yet. He's been saying that for a week. Little questions. Criticisms. She exhaled. He told me today that he thinks I'm becoming someone different, and he's not sure he signed up for that person. The room was very quiet. What did you tell him? Amara asked. Celeste turned, and her face, without the event around it, without the performance, without the 47 people and the champagne and the crimson gown, was just a face. Young and frightened and more honest than Amara had seen it. I told him he should probably figure out if he actually knew who he signed up for. Celeste said. Because I'm starting to think I didn't know who I was until 3 days ago. She left. Amara stood alone in the sewing room with the gown on its dress form and the Donspirian, the last of the afternoon light coming through the north window and the needle kit in her hands and the absolute certain knowledge that this was no longer a story about a dress. It had become something larger and considerably less predictable. And somewhere in the foundation of everything that had seemed settled, Celeste's wedding, Preston's confidence, the invisible arrangement of the Harrington household, Amara's own carefully maintained distance from the life she'd left, something had cracked clean through. She picked up her bag. She went home to her daughter. And she did not look back at the gown as she left, because looking back had never once helped her, and she had learned, across 14 years of going on, that some things you can only face by walking toward. The question, the one that was going to demand an answer before this was over, was whether what she was walking toward an ending or a beginning, and whether those two things were even as different as she'd always believed them to be. She should have seen it coming. That was the thing she kept returning to in the days after. Not with self-pity. She didn't have the luxury of self-pity, had never been able to afford it, but with the cold, clear-eyed assessment of someone who had been trained to read structural weakness and had missed the one that mattered most. She should have seen Preston Whitmore coming. The fourth day of work on the gown started like the others. Early bus. Cold morning. The particular gray of Charleston before the sun committed to being up. She arrived at the estate at 6:50, let herself in through the kitchen entrance as always, put on the coffee because that was what she did, and went upstairs to the sewing room. The gown was exactly where she'd left it the night before, on the dress form, under the light linen cover. She'd draped over it to protect the silk from dust. She lifted the cover and checked her work from the previous session, the way a doctor checks its patient's chart before rounds, clinically, systematically, looking for anything that had shifted overnight. Nothing had shifted. The reinforcement was holding. The French seam was 2/3 complete. The thread tension exactly what it needed to be. The surface of the silk restored to a finish that was genuinely indistinguishable from the original. She had, at some point in the last 4 days, stopped working on the gown and started working with it, the way you do with a piece that has its own logic, its own internal coherence that you have to find rather than impose. She put on her magnifying glasses. She picked up her needle. She had 40 minutes of uninterrupted work before she heard the footsteps in the hall. Not Celeste's footsteps, not Mr. Aldrich's, not Vivian's careful, deliberate gait. These were footsteps that covered ground quickly and without apology, the footsteps of a man who moved through spaces as if he'd already decided what he was going to do when he got there. Preston didn't knock. He came through the sewing room door like the gesture of knocking hadn't occurred to him, which was probably true. He was dressed for travel, a jacket, a bag over his shoulder, his hair slightly less composed than it had been the day before. He looked like a man who had been awake for a while, making decisions, and the decisions had left marks on his face. He looked at her. She looked at him. She kept the needle in her hand. "We need to talk," he said. "I'm working. It'll wait." "The silk won't," she said. "I'm in the middle of a tension-sensitive passage. If I stop at the wrong point, I'll have to redo 3 hours of work." He came further into the room anyway. He set his bag down on the chair by the windows, Celeste's chair, the one she'd started sitting in on her evening visits, and crossed his arms. The posture of a man establishing territory. "I'm asking you to stop," he said. She looked at him over the magnifying glasses with the particular quality of attention that said she had heard him, registered him, and was continuing anyway. She ran the needle through twice more, found her stopping point, set the needle in its holder. She took off the glasses and looked at him directly. "What do you want to tell me?" she said. Preston uncrossed his arms. He moved to the work table and stood across from her with his hands flat on the surface, not threateningly, but with the pressure of someone who wanted to make sure they had both sides of the table accounted for. "I know what you're doing," he said. "I'm restoring a gown." "I'm not talking about the gown." She waited. "Celeste has canceled 2 social commitments this week. She's pulled out of an event that matters." He stopped, recalibrated. "There are people in this family's circle who notice when things change, who ask questions. The timing of her—" he searched for the word, reevaluation, let's call it, is not incidental to your presence in this house. Amara looked at him steadily. You think I'm influencing her. I think you're a very intelligent woman who found an opening and walked through it. I was asked to fix a dress. You were asked to fix a dress, he agreed. And somehow in the process you've become, he opened one hand, this, whatever this is. The woman my fiancé can't stop talking about. The woman my future mother-in-law looks at like she's owed some kind of. He stopped again, pressed his lips together. You've made them feel guilty, Amara. And guilt makes people do irrational things. She was quiet for a moment. You came in here to tell me that, she said. I came in here to ask you professionally, respectfully to finish the gown and go back to your normal role. Whatever that looked like before. My normal role, she said. Your employment here. He held her gaze, which is still available to you. Nobody's suggesting anything different. She understood then, not slowly, not in pieces, all at once, with the totality of comprehension that comes when you finally see the thing that was always there. He was afraid, not of her specifically, of what she represented, of the mirror that her presence had apparently become in his house, reflecting back things that Celeste was now looking at and questioning. And when men like Preston Whitmore were afraid, they moved to contain the source of the fear before the fear could spread. When are you leaving? She asked. He blinked. What? Your bag, she said. You're packed. Where are you going? A beat. Business trip. Charlotte. 3 days. And you wanted to have this conversation before you left. I wanted, he exhaled. Yes, before I left. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that he shifted his weight. Long enough that the silence became something he had to manage, rather than something that was just neutral space. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I am going to finish this gown. I am going to do it, to the standard it deserves. And when it's done, I will return to my regular schedule in this house, assuming that is still what the Harringtons want. She paused. What Celeste is going through has nothing to do with me. It has to do with her, and the questions she's asking are questions she was already carrying. I was just there when she started asking them. He held her eyes. That's a convenient explanation. It's the true one. You don't know Celeste the way I do. No, she agreed. I know her differently than you do. That's not the same as less. Something's moved through his expression. A quick, dark thing she couldn't entirely name. Anger, partly. But something else underneath it. Something that looked like the beginning of a recognition he didn't want to have. Picked up his bag. At the door, he stopped. Didn't turn around. The wedding is in 19 days, he said. I need it to happen. She said nothing. He left. She stood at the work table for a moment, not moving, just letting the conversation settle into its proper place in her understanding of the situation. Then she picked up her needle, and she went back to work because the gown needed her, and Preston Whitmore needed to not be the thing she was thinking about when she ran thread through $50,000 silk. She worked until noon. It was the sound that told her something was wrong. Not a crash or a raised voice, something quieter and therefore worse. A door closing on the floor below, with the particular controlled force of someone trying very hard not to slam it. Followed by footsteps on the main staircase, ascending rapidly, not with Celeste's usual easy grace, but with the slightly off-rhythm quality of someone moving through emotion. Amara set down her needle. The sewing room door opened. Celeste came in, and Amara had never seen her like this. She was still perfectly put together on the surface, because Celeste's surface was load-bearing, in a way that Amara now understood was its own kind of survival mechanism. But underneath the surface, something was badly wrong. Her eyes were too bright. Her breathing was shallow. She was holding her phone in her left hand with the screen facing down, and the way she was holding it, the tension in her knuckles told Amara that whatever was on that screen had done something. Close the door, Amara said. Celeste closed it. She stood in the middle of the sewing room and looked at Amara and said, How long have you known? Amara said, Known what? Celeste turned the phone over. She held it up so Amara could see the screen. It was a photograph, taken at what looked like a restaurant candlelit, private, the kind of place that made its money on discretion. Preston, sitting across from a woman Amara didn't recognize. They for not sitting the way colleagues sit. The angle of the image taken from some distance, through glass, was clearly not meant to be flattering or clear, but it was clear enough. Amara looked at it for the time it required to understand what she was looking at. She looked at Celeste. I don't know anything about that, she said. He was in Charlotte, Celeste said. He left this morning. He told me he had a business trip. She turned the phone back over. My cousin Brooke's college roommate lives in Charlotte. She was at dinner at the same restaurant. Her voice was mechanical, in the way that voices go mechanical when the alternative is falling apart in a way you can't take back. She recognized him. She sent the photo to Brooke. A pause. Brooke sent it to me an hour ago. The room was very still. How long? Celeste asked again. And this time the question was not directed at Amara specifically, but at the room, at the air, at the specific cruelty of a thing becoming undeniable. Celeste, how long has this been? How does someone? She stopped. Her jaw was tight with the effort of not letting her voice break. We've been together for 3 years. We've been engaged for 11 months. I've been planning. She pressed her lips together. My mother has spent $400,000 on this wedding. Amara didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, at the work table, giving Celeste the full respect of not rushing toward her or retreating from her. Sometimes, the most decent thing you can do for someone in pain is stay still and let them take up all the space the pain requires. Do you want to sit down? Amara asked. No. Then, yes. She sat in the chair by the window, her chair, the one she'd claimed over the last 4 days of evening visits. She sat in it with her back straight and her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the garden, which was doing nothing wrong and probably shouldn't have to witness this. I should call him, Celeste said. That's one option. I should call him and... She stopped. What do you say? She looked at Amara. What do you say to someone who... She opened her hands. What are the words? I don't know, Amara said honestly. I've never had to say them. Lucky you. Not luck. Different circumstances. Celeste looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, a short, raw sound that had nothing pleasant in it. Right, she said. Because your circumstances were... She stopped. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make this about. It's all right, it's not. Celeste looked at the phone in her hands. Nothing is all right now. She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that the sounds of the house asserted themselves somewhere below, a door, the distant sound of Vivienne's voice on a phone call, the creak of the old building settling in the midday heat. He came to see you this morning, Celeste said. It wasn't a question. Yes. What did he say? Amara considered what to give her. Not everything. Not because she was protecting Preston. She felt no particular need to protect Preston. But because Celeste was already handling more than she could cleanly hold, and adding the weight of his conversation this morning on top of the photograph was more than the situation needed right now. He asked me to finish the work and return to my regular schedule, Amara said. He seemed concerned about your state of mind. Something moved through Celeste's expression. He was, what, managing the situation? That was the impression I got. Celeste sat with that for a moment. He knew, she said slowly, this morning. He knew I was going to it at some point, eventually. He knew, she looked up. He came to talk to you because he thought you were the destabilizing element. He thought if he could contain you, everything would stabilize. He'd go to Charlotte and do whatever he does in Charlotte and come back, and everything would still be on track. She said it with the particular velocity of someone thinking out loud through a thing they should have thought about before and didn't. That's how he thinks, Celeste said. He identifies the problem and he neutralizes it. That's what he does at work. That's what she stopped. That's what he's been doing to me. For how long? How long has he been identifying and neutralizing? She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. I invited this person into my family. Celeste. My mother, her voice broke on the word just for a second, and she caught it and held it. My mother has poured herself into this. She's gave up things for this wedding. Time. Energy. She exhaled. My father died 2 years ago. He died before he could see this, and she has been doing this all, of this partly, because she thought it was what my father would have. She stopped, pressed her lips together again, held it. I cannot tell her today. I cannot walk downstairs and... You don't have to tell her today, Amara said. Celeste looked at her. You know I do. I know you think you do. That's not the same thing. She's going to. Celeste's eyes were wet now, but they weren't spilling. She was holding it with the same structural determination the gown's original seamstress had brought to a seam that eventually failed anyway. She's going to be destroyed. She's going to think. He's going to wonder if she missed something, and she'll blame herself. And she doesn't deserve that. Mara was quiet. Did you know? Celeste asked. Not the same question as before. A different one, about him. Did you see something Yesterday, Amara said carefully. In this room. He said he needed the wedding to happen. The exact words, I need it to happen. Not I want it. Not I'm looking forward to it. She paused. A man who is happy about his wedding doesn't talk about it like it's a deadline. Celeste closed her eyes. I noticed that, Amara said. I didn't know what it meant. I just noticed it. You noticed more about my fiancé in 2 days than I noticed in 3 years. Celeste's voice was flat and wrecked at the same time. You were too close to see clearly. That's not a flaw. That's just proximity. Celeste opened her eyes. She looked at the gown on the dress form. At the crimson silk under the light, the perfectly restored seam that Amara had been rebuilding stitch by stitch for 4 days. All of this, Celeste said. She wasn't talking about the gown. She sat in the chair for another few minutes without speaking. Amara let her. She went back to the work table, and she cleaned her needles, and she reorganized her thread selection, with the quiet focus of someone who understands that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer another person is the normalcy of watching someone continue to do their work. Eventually, Celeste stood. She smoothed her shirt, the automatic gesture of someone reassembling themselves from the outside in, because it was somewhere to start. I'm going to call him, she said. All right. And then I'm going to talk to my mother. Amara nodded. Celeste moved toward the doors. Stopped. Turned back with the particular expression of someone who has something else to say and is deciding whether to say it. If I cancel the wedding, she said, what happens to... She looked at the gown. What happens to all of this? Amara looked at the gown too. At 4 days of her work. At the French seam now nearly complete. At the restored surface of the lion silk, invisible in its perfection. At the structural repair that had converted a catastrophic failure in waiting into something that could hold indefinitely under any pressure asked of it. The work is done regardless, Amara said. The gown is either worn or it isn't, but it's fixed either way. Celeste nodded. Thank you, she said. She left. The sewing room was quiet. Amara stood at the work table and looked at the gown and felt very precisely the weight of being in the center of a situation she had not sought, had not orchestrated, and could not now step out of cleanly. She had come to this house 4 years ago with a set of simple boundaries, professional, invisible, adequate. She had stayed inside those boundaries with the discipline and intention. And then a woman had pointed at her across a room full of people and said something cruel, and Amara had said fine, instead of looking at the floor. That was where it started. One word. She thought about destiny, about the cough that had persisted into the 4th day, about the specialist she'd been putting off scheduling for 3 weeks, about the rent and the early bus, and the 4 years of mornings starting at 4:30. She picked up her needle. She went back to the gown. The afternoon unraveled slowly, the way afternoons do when there is dread of some variety moving through a house. She could feel it in the building, the long silence from the lower floors, then brief sounds that suggested conversations, then silence again. At some point, she heard Vivian's voice, raised in a tone she'd never heard from her before. Not anger. Something rawer than anger. The sound of a person being handed something they have to carry and don't know if they can. She kept working. At 3:30, her phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. She was at a critical point in the seam, but the number was Destiny School, and her hand moved before the thought completed. Miss Ellison, the school secretary, Mrs. Park. Destiny is in the nurse's office. She's been running a fever since after lunch, and she's asking for you. The needle went into its holder. The magnifying glasses came off. I'll be there, Amara said, 20 minutes. She was packing her bag when Vivian appeared in the doorway of the sewing room. She looked. Amara had never seen Vivian Harrington look like this. She had always looked like a woman who had made her peace with whatever life handed her and arranged it neatly. Now she looked like someone standing in the aftermath of something that could not be arranged. Her eyes were dry. That was the thing. Not tearful, drained. The way eyes look after tears, the aftermath rather than the event. Your daughter, Vivian said. She had heard Amara on the phone. The walls in this house were old, and the sound traveled. She's got a fever, I need to go. Of course. Vivian stepped aside. Then Amara. She stopped. Vivian pressed her lips together. She was a woman who chose her words, with the care of someone who understood their weight. I need you to know, she said, that whatever happens in this house, With this situation, it has nothing to do with your position here. Your work here is not conditional. She paused. I want that to be clear. Amara looked at her. At this woman who ran a household like a controlled environment and had just had her daughter's engagement blown open by a photograph from Charlotte. Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. Vivian, the older woman said, quietly, like a door opening that had been closed for 4 years. Please. Amara held her gaze for one moment. Thank you, Vivian. She went downstairs and got her coat from the kitchen hook and left through the kitchen entrance and walked to the bus stop with her bag over her shoulder and her needle kit inside it, and the feeling, acute and unignorable, that the careful, invisible life she had constructed around herself over 4 years of showing up and doing the work and going home was not going to survive the next 19 days intact. She got to the school in 22 minutes. The bus ran 3 minutes late, which it always did, and which she had never not noticed. Destiny was in the nurse's office, on the little cot they kept for sick kids, wrapped in a paper-thin institutional blanket and looking small in the way that children only look small when they don't feel well. Her braids were coming undone. She had a thermometer crease on her cheek from lying on her side. Hey, baby, Amara said. Destiny's eyes opened. Mama. Her voice was hoarse. I told Mrs. Park you were busy. I'm never too busy for you. She pressed her hand to Destiny's forehead. Hot. Not alarming, but real. How long have you felt bad? Since math. Destiny scrunched her nose. I was gonna push through, but Mrs. Park saw me, and she said I looked like a wet sock. She's not wrong. Amara helped her up. Let's get you home. She signed the checkout form. She helped Destiny into her coat. She steered her out of the school with one hand on her small shoulder and felt the precise intersection of the life she was actually living. This child, this cough, this 22-minute bus ride, and the life she'd been inside all day at the Harrington estate with its $60,000 gown and its unraveling engagement and its photograph from Charlotte. On the bus, Destiny leaned against her arm. Did something happen today? Destiny asked. She had her mother's instincts, which was sometimes inconvenient. Things happen every day, Amara said. Something different. Amara looked out the window. There's a family I work for. They're going through something hard right now. Destiny thought about this. Are you helping them? I fixed their dress. That's not what I asked. Amara looked down at her daughter, 9 years old, and already too perceptive for anyone's comfort, including her own. I'm in the middle of it, Amara said. I'm not sure yet what I'm helping. Destiny accepted that and put her head back on her mother's arm. By the time they got home, she was half asleep. Amara got her into bed, got the thermometer 102, which was manageable but not ignorable, and sat in the kitchen for a moment with the light on and her phone in her hand. She opened the number for the pediatric specialist she'd been putting off, the one she'd been calculating about for 3 weeks. The copay, the timing, the logistics of a specialist appointment while working full-time without sick days. She looked at it. Celeste had said she wanted to help. She'd said it in this specific, careful way. That wasn't charity exactly, or at least that wasn't how it had felt. Amara didn't call the number. Not yet. She sat with the question. She was still sitting with it when her phone rang. Not Celeste. Not the school. A number she didn't recognize, local Charleston Exchange, but not one she had saved. She answered anyway. Is this Amara Ellison? A woman's voice. Professional. Slightly cautious, as though she was not entirely certain she was calling the right person. It is. Miss Ellison, my name is Diana Reeves. I'm the managing director at Bellamy Atelier on King Street. A pause. I don't know if you're familiar with us. Amara knew the name. Everyone in Charleston, with any awareness of the fashion world, knew Bellamy Atelier, a bridal and couture restaurant house that had been operating on King Street for 22 years and had a waiting list that ran 8 months since out. The kind of place that did not advertise. The kind of place that clients found by knowing the right people. I'm familiar, Amara said carefully. I had a conversation this afternoon with a colleague of yours, Diana Reeves said. A Mr. Aldrich. He was a slight pause, he was very direct. He called me at 2 o'clock, and he described the diagnostic work you did on a gown this week, and he asked me to call you. Another pause. He described your training background. Under Fontenot. Amara's hand tightened slightly on the phone. He did, she said. I would like to meet with you, Diana Reeves said. At your earliest convenience. We have a position that has been difficult to fill. Not a general seamstress role, a restoration and construction specialist position that we've been searching for 14 months. She paused again. Mr. Aldrich said, "Your work on the lion silk is," and I'm quoting him here, "the finest corrective couture he has seen, performed outside a professional atelier in his 30-year career." The kitchen was very quiet. Destiny's cough came faintly from the bedroom, the small cycling sound that had been the background of every morning for 2 weeks. Amara closed her eyes. She opened them. "When?" she said. "Would tomorrow afternoon work?" "Say, 4 o'clock." She calculated. She could finish the critical pass on the gown by 3 at the latest. She could make 4 o'clock. "Yes," she said. "Wonderful. I'll text you the address." "I have it," Amara said. A short pause, and she heard in that pause the slight recalibration of someone realizing they were dealing with a person who knew exactly where Bellamy Atelier was, and had known for a long time. "Of course," Diana Reeves said. "We'll see you tomorrow." The call ended. Amara sat in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about Mr. Aldrich making that call quietly, without mentioning it to her, with the absolute conviction of a craftsman who had recognized another craftsman and decided the most useful thing he could do was open a door. She thought about what it meant that he'd called on the 4th day, after watching her work, after seeing what 15 years of not working had not taken from her hands. She thought about Destiny in the next room, running a fever, with her father's nose and her mother's stubbornness. She thought about Preston Whitmore and his bag packed for Charlotte. She thought about Celeste sitting in the chair by the window, turning the photograph over in her hands, asking how long. She thought about the gown on the dress form in the sewing room of a house that was currently in the early stages of falling apart around it. The gown she had repaired stitch by stitch, the structural failure she had found and fixed, the lion silk she had restored to a surface that showed no trace of what had almost destroyed it from the inside. She thought about all of it, and then she stopped thinking about all of it and went to check on her daughter. Because that was the thing that was hers and real and present, and everything else was going to demand everything she had in the days ahead, and she needed to be whole for it. But as she stood in the doorway of Destiny's room, watching her daughter sleep with the crooked braids and the fever flush, and the absolute unconscious trust of a child in her own bed, she understood something that she hadn't entirely understood before. The door Diana Reeves had just opened was real. The opportunity on the other side of it was real. And for the first time in 14 years, the thing standing between Amara and that door was not circumstances, or grief, or the unpredictable machinery of a life that kept handing her impossibilities. The thing standing between her and that door was the question of what she was willing to become, and whether becoming it meant dismantling the careful, invisible, adequate life she had built around the ruins of the other one, the one she'd left in New York, the one she'd put in a box under the winter coats, or whether it meant finally understanding that those ruins had never stopped being the foundation of something. She went to bed at 11. She did not sleep until well after midnight, and in the morning, the phone on her nightstand lit up with a message from a number she didn't have saved, sent at 6:17 a. Before she'd had her toast or caught her bus, or gone back to the gown or any of it. The message said, "I ended it. The weddings is off. I need to talk to you today. Not about the gown, about what comes next." Amara read it once. Read it again. Set the phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark for exactly 3 minutes, breathing, thinking, understanding that the ground under everything had just shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. Then she got up. The message was still on her phone when she got to the estate. She hadn't responded to it. She'd read it twice in the dark of her bedroom, set the phone down, gotten up, made toast, checked Destiny's fever down to 99.3. Manageable, Mrs. Reyes would come at 7 and taken the bus without answering. Not because she didn't know what to say, because she needed to see the gown first. She needed to be in the work before she was in anything else, because the work was the only thing in her life right now that had clean edges. Everything else was fraying. The estate was different that morning. She felt it before she saw anything specific, the quality of the silence, the way the kitchen lights were on but nobody was in the kitchen, the absence of the routine sounds that usually accompanied a house with staff starting their day. She put on the coffee. She went upstairs. The sewing room was untouched. The gown was where she'd left it. She put on her magnifying glasses and picked up her needle, and for 20 minutes she was nowhere but inside the work, which was where she needed to be. The French seam was almost complete. One more careful session, 2 hours, maybe 3, and the exterior restoration pass, and the gown would be finished. Structurally sound, visually indistinguishable from its original condition, capable of holding under any pressure the wedding day could generate. Except there was no wedding day anymore. She kept working anyway. At 8:15, Celeste knocked. 2 raps on the doorframe, which she'd learned to do, and then she waited. "Come in," Amara said. Celeste looked like someone who had not slept. Not in the dramatic way of movies, no smeared makeup, no dramatic dishevelment, but in the specific, exhausted way of a person who had spent a night making irreversible decisions and living inside the weight of them. She was wearing clothes she'd clearly pulled on without much thought. Her hair was back, plain. The engagement ring was not on her hand. Amara noticed the absence of the ring the way she noticed structural details automatically, without drama. Celeste sat in the chair by the window. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You got my message," Celeste said. "I did. You didn't answer." "I needed to think." Celeste nodded. She looked at the gown on the dress form. At the crimson silk, in the morning light, the work nearly complete. "You're still fixing it," she said. "It needs to be finished." "Even though the work needs to be finished," Amara said again. Not harshly. Just with the finality of someone whose relationship to their craft operated on different logic than the circumstances around it. Celeste accepted that. "He came back last night," she said. "Preston. He drove back from Charlotte at midnight." She pressed her fingers together in her lap. "He said he deserved the chance to explain." Amara kept her needle moving. "Did he explain?" "He explained a lot of things." Her voice was level in the way that level voices are when the alternative has already been spent. Most of them were about context, about how things were complicated, about how the woman in the photograph was, he used the word situation. She was a situation. Celeste exhaled through her nose. "He used that word 4 times. I counted." "What did you say?" "I said that I was also apparently a situation, and I was done being managed." She paused. "He got angry then. Not he doesn't throw things or raise his voice. It's quieter than that. He gets very still and very precise, and he says things that are technically not insults but function as them." She looked at her hands. He said that I had been destabilized by a housekeeper who was manipulating my guilt for her own purposes. The needle stopped, just for a second. Then it continued. "He said that?" Amara asked. "Yes." "What did you say to that?" "I told him to get out of my house." Celeste's jaw was set. It took 3 more hours to actually make that happen. But eventually it did. Amara looked at her over the magnifying glasses. "Are you all right?" "No." Celeste said it without hesitation, without apology, without the social reflex of "I'm fine" that most people would have reached for. It was, Amara thought, possibly the most honest thing she'd said in the 2 weeks they'd been having conversations in this room. "No, I'm not all right. My engagement is over. My mother spent the night crying in her room. I have 450 guests who are going to need to be notified, and I have a wedding venue booked for 19 days from now." She paused. "But I know I made the right decision. I know it the way I know things when I'm not lying to myself." She looked at the ringless hand in her lap. "I haven't known very many things that clearly in a long time." Amara finished the passage she was working on. She set the needle in its holder. She took off the magnifying glasses. "What did you want to talk to me about?" she said. "Your message said not the gown." Celeste looked at her directly. "Mr. Aldrich told me he called Bellamy Atelier." Amara was still. "He told me this morning," Celeste said. "He called to let me know he'd done it. He seemed to think I should know." A pause. "Diana Reeves called you?" "Yesterday afternoon." "Are you going to meet with her?" "Today, 4 o'clock." Celeste nodded slowly. She looked at the gown again. When she spoke, her voice had something different in it. Careful, measured. The voice of someone navigating something they weren't sure they had the right to navigate. "I want to do something," Celeste said, "and I need you to hear me before you say no." Amara waited. "I have contacts," Celeste said, "from the wedding planning photographers, designers, event people who have been in and out of this house for the last 11 months. One of them is a woman named Laurel Foss, who writes for a magazine called Southern Couture. It's regional, but it has real reach in the industry." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "I want to tell her about you. Not as a charity story, not as a feel-good piece about a housekeeper with hidden talents. As a professional profile, your training, your work on the gown, your eye for structural diagnostics. She paused, with photographs of the restoration work. Before and after, Amara looked at her. You don't need my permission to talk to a journalist, she said. No, but I need to know if you're willing to be part of it. There's a difference between me telling a story and you being visible in it. She met Amara's eyes. You've been invisible in this house for 4 years. I don't want to make you visible in a way that takes that choice away from you too. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a bird was doing something emphatic in a hedge. The sound came through the window and landed in the silence between them. Let me think about it, Amara said. Of course. After today's meeting, I'll let you know. Celeste nodded and stood. She moved toward the door, then stopped. She was always stopping at this door, Amara had noticed. This threshold seemed to be where Celeste did her thinking. Amara, she said. Not Amara the way she used to say at the summons, the slight lift at the end. Just her name, plain. Yes, he was wrong, Celeste said. About what he said. About you manipulating anything? I want you to know I know that. I know you know that. I wanted to say it out loud. In this room, she paused. Because the last few weeks, too many things have been said in this room that needed to be said out loud and weren't. She left. Amara put her magnifying glasses back on and went back to the gown, and she worked steadily until 11:30, when she heard the first sign that the day was about to become something other than what she'd planned for. The front door. Not the kitchen entrance, the front door, which made a different sound, heavier and more formal. And then voices in the foyer below, and one of them she recognized and one of them she didn't, and the tone of both of them was the tone of people who had not come to the house for any pleasant reason. She kept working. 10 minutes later, Vivienne appeared in the sewing room doorway. She was dressed formally, more formally than the hour required, which told Amara she had prepared herself for something. Her posture was the posture she brought to situations she intended to control. Amara, her voice was careful. Preston is downstairs. He's brought someone with him, a lawyer. Amara looked up. He's making a claim, Vivienne said, against the family. Against, she stopped, pressed her lips together. He's saying the engagement was broken without cause. He's talking about the ring. It was a family piece, his grandmother's stone. The setting was ours, but she exhaled. He's also saying, another pause longer, he's making a claim about you, about me. He's suggesting that your presence in this house, your relationship with Celeste, constitutes undue influence. Vivienne's voice was flat and controlled, and underneath the control was something that might have been fury, the quiet kind that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. He's saying you interfered with the engagement deliberately. The needle was in Amara's hand. She was aware of it. She set it down. She looked at Vivienne. He's saying that in front of a lawyer. Amara said, his lawyer, yes. She took off the magnifying glasses. She set them on the work table. She looked at the gown for one moment, at the nearly complete seam, at the morning's work, at the silk that was finally fully restored, and she thought about what it meant that she had spent 5 days fixing something for a wedding that no longer existed, while the man who'd been at the center of that wedding was downstairs with a lawyer, making claims about her character. She thought about Diana Reeves and the 4 o'clock meeting. She thought about Destiny's Fever and the specialist and the calculation she'd been running for 3 weeks. She thought about Preston Whitmore standing in this room 4 days ago with his bag over his shoulder, telling her he needed the wedding to happen. She stood up. Where is Celeste? She said. In the sitting room with the lawyer. Preston's lawyer is he's not. Vivienne's composure shifted fractionally. He's aggressive. He's making this very unpleasant. And your lawyer? I've called her. She'll be here within the hour. All right. Amara came around the work table. I want to go downstairs. Vivienne looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked at Vivienne directly. But he's making claims about me, and he's doing it in your house, and I'd like to be in the room for that. Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, the same kind of recalibrating look she'd had in the kitchen the day of the fitting, the look of a woman revising an equation. All right, Vivienne said. They went downstairs together. The sitting room was the formal one at the front of the house, the room Amara had cleaned approximately 200 times in 4 years and had never once sat in. It was a beautiful room, objectively. Old furniture, good light, the particular stillness of a space that was maintained for occasions. This was an occasion. Preston was standing near the fireplace. He was dressed for the day in the deliberate way he had of dressing everything correct, nothing accidental. Beside him was a man in his 50s, with the compact, precise energy of someone who charged by the hour and was comfortable with conflict. Celeste was on the settee, straight-backed, her hands in her lap. She looked up when Amara came in, and something in her face changed a small shift, like the adjustment of a person who has just been handed something they needed. Preston saw Amara come in and his jaw tightened. "She doesn't need to be here," he said, to Vivienne. "Not to Amara, she's here," Vivienne said. Amara crossed the room and stood to the left of Celeste's position, not behind her, not in front, beside. She stood there with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Preston Whitmore, and she waited. Preston's lawyer, the name would turn out to be Garrett Fitch, which was the kind of name that existed specifically to belong to lawyers like him, turned to acknowledge Amara with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to show his cards in his face. "Miss Ellison," he said. "I'm glad you're here, actually. It saves time." "I imagine it does," she said. "My client's position," Fitch said, addressing the room, "is straightforward. The engagement was terminated abruptly and without reasonable cause. The circumstances of its termination include a significant change in Ms. Harrington's behavior and judgment over the past 2 weeks, coinciding precisely with he paused just long enough to make the pause deliberate, the elevated involvement of a household employee in the family's private affairs." Celeste's hands tightened in her lap. Amara could see it from where she stood. "I want to be specific," Fitch continued, "because specificity matters here. Ms. Harrington canceled social commitments. She withdrew from engagements. She ended a 3-year relationship and an 11-month engagement on the basis of a fictional whose context she did not investigate. And all of this occurred during a period when a domestic employee was given unusual and unprecedented access to private family spaces and private family conversations." He stopped. He looked at Amara. "Miss Ellison," he said, "did you or did you not advise Ms. Harrington on her personal relationship?" "I did not," Amara said. "Did you discuss Mr. Whitmore with Miss Harrington?" "She discussed him with me. I listened." "Did you offer opinions?" "I answered direct questions." Fitch's expression didn't move. "What questions?" "She asked me what Mr. Whitmore said when he came to see me in the sewing room. I told her what he said." Amara paused. "Which was that he needed the wedding to happen." Something shifted in the room. Small, but there. Preston's face stayed controlled, but his weight shifted barely, a fraction back onto his left heel. "He came to see you," Fitch said carefully. "On the morning of the day he left for Charlotte," Amara said. "He came to the sewing room. He told me to finish the work and return to my regular duties. He told me Celeste was being destabilized by my presence. And he told me he needed the wedding to happen. And you reported this conversation to Ms. Harrington. She asked me about it. I told her the truth." "Why did she ask?" "Because she knew he'd come to see me. She knew he'd come to manage a situation." Amara looked at Preston directly. "His word. He told me Celeste was identifying and neutralizing problems. I believe he was describing his own process." Preston's control showed its first hairline crack. "That is an extraordinary mischaracterization, Preston." Fitch's hand moved slightly, a subtle professional gesture of stop. Preston stopped. Fitch looked at Amara with the recalculated attention of someone who had walked into a room expecting a particular kind of obstacle and found a different kind. "Miss Ellison," he said, "you have a meeting this afternoon with Bellamy Atelier." The room adjusted. Celeste looked at Amara sharply. Vivienne's head turned. Amara kept her face still. "I do," she said. "A meeting arranged." Fitch glanced at his notes. A performance, he already knew, through the recommendation of a Mr. Aldrich, who was hired for this engagement by the Harrington family. He looked up. "A meeting for a position that would represent a significant professional advancement for you." "Yes." "Do you see how this might appear?" he said. "A domestic employee builds a relationship with a wealthy family during a time of personal crisis. Her profile is elevated. Doors open. The engagement ends." He tilted his head slightly. It's a pattern that a reasonable person might find worth examining. The room was very still. Amara looked at him. She thought about the fitting room 3 weeks ago, about Celeste's hand pointing across it, about if Amara can fit into this dress, about the 47 people who had all been waiting to watch her be humiliated. She thought about 4 years of mornings at 4:30, and the gray uniform and the champagne tray, and the woman who had never learned her last name. She thought about the box under the winter coats, and Marguerite Fontenot's letter, and the needle kit that had been waiting for 15 years. She thought about Destiny's cough, and the specialist, and the rent, and the cold bus, and all the weight of a life that had been survivable, because she had made it survivable through sheer relentless competence. And then she thought about the gown upstairs, on the dress form, about the failure point she had found with her fingers, about the way fabric tells you where the weight is going, if you know how to read it, about the fact that she had spent 5 days repairing something from the inside out, and when it was done, you could not see where the damage had been. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I found a structural defect in a $60,000 gown that your client's fiancé was going to wear, in front of 450 people. I found it because I have 15 years of professional training, and because I was close enough to look. I fixed it because it needed to be fixed, and I was the person in the room qualified to do so." She held his gaze without effort. If that work, if 5 days of couture restoration done at that level opened a professional door for me, that's not a pattern. That's a consequence. Those are different things. Fitch looked at her. Preston looked at her. Celeste, on the settee, looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite tears, and was something more complicated than either. Furthermore, Amara said, and her voice was still level, still without heat, the voice of someone who has been carrying the full weight of their own expertise for a long time, and has finally decided to set it down where everyone can see it. "I'd like you to think very carefully about the claim you're making. You're suggesting that a black domestic worker manipulated a wealthy white family into dismantling their daughter's engagement. In a city like Charleston, with a claim like that, I want to be sure you've considered every direction that story travels when it leaves this room." Silence. The kind that has a specific texture, the texture of people doing very rapid calculations. Preston's lawyer looked at his notepad, not because anything was written there that he hadn't already read, because he needed a second. Preston himself had gone very still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing a room, the stillness of a man who has just understood something about the territory he walked into. Celeste stood up. She stood up from the settee, and she was not the woman from the fitting room, not the woman with the champagne and the crimson gown, and the 47 witnesses. She was someone who had spent 3 weeks being cracked open, and was standing in the wreckage of it with her back straight. "I ended the engagement," she said, "not because of Amara. Because of a photograph my cousin's friend took in Charlotte, because she recognized my fiancé at a restaurant with another woman." She looked at Preston. "You want to contest that?" "Contest that." She looked at Fitch. "You want to make a claim about undue influence? There are 47 people who were in this house the day your client publicly humiliated my employee. And there are 4 years of documented employment that will show you exactly what kind of influence Amara Ellison has exerted in this house, which is the kind where she comes to work at 6:15 and does her job and goes home." Her voice was not raised. It was something worse than raised, it was certain. "And I will tell every one of those 47 people, and every person connected to this family, exactly what you're attempting to do here, in this room, right now." Fitch looked at Preston. Preston looked at Celeste. The calculation happening behind his eyes was visible, for the first time the actual calculation, not the managed version. The one where he was weighing the story, if it went further against the story, if it stopped here. "The ring," Fitch said. His voice had changed smaller, more procedural, the voice of someone retreating to safer ground. "The stone is being assessed by our jeweler today," Vivian said from the doorway. She had not moved since they'd come downstairs. She had stood in the doorway of her own sitting room and let the room happen, and now she spoke with the absolute, unhurried authority of a woman who had decided exactly where the line was. "You'll have our response through our attorney. Who will be here?" She glanced at her watch. "In approximately 30 minutes. Fitch closed his notepad. "We'll be in touch," he said. He left. Preston stood for a moment in the room. In this room, he'd walked through dozens of times as a welcome guest, as a future son-in-law, as the man the Harringtons had been preparing to absorb into their family. He stood in it and looked at Celeste, and something moved through his face that Amara couldn't entirely name and wasn't sure she wanted to. Not guilt. She didn't think Preston was built for guilt, the way some people were built for certain frequencies of sound, but something adjacent, a recognition without a name. Celeste, he said. Don't, she said. He left. The front door, the formal one, closed behind him with its heavy final sound. The sitting room breathed. Celeste sat back down on the settee and pressed both hands over her face for a moment, not crying, just containing, just holding the pressure in. Then she dropped her hands and looked at Amara with red-rimmed eyes and the ghost of something that was going to be, eventually on the other side of this, something like relief. You didn't have to say what you said, Celeste said. I said what was true. You said it knowing it would cost you something. Everything costs something, Amara said. I've been doing the math on that for 15 years. I know what I can afford. Vivienne came into the room properly. She sat in the chair across from Celeste, sat in it with the care of a woman whose legs were tired, which was the first concession to physical reality Amara had ever seen from her. Your father would have, Vivienne stopped. Started differently. Your father would have had words for this morning. Good ones or bad ones? Celeste asked. Probably both, Vivienne said. And there was something in it that was not quite a smile, but was the direction of one. Amara looked at the clock on the mantel. 11:47. I'm going back upstairs, she said. I have 3 hours of work left on the gown. I'm going to finish it. Both of them looked at her. The gown, Celeste said. It needs to be finished. But the wedding... I know there's no wedding, Amara said. The gown still needs to be finished. A piece of work at that level doesn't get abandoned because the circumstances changed. She looked at Celeste. You'll find another occasion to wear it, or you'll have it restored and stored, and one day Destiny's age will be your age, and she'll want to know whose hands fixed it. She paused. Either way, it deserves to be whole. She left the sitting room. She went back upstairs. She put on the magnifying glasses. She picked up the needle. She found her place in the seam. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with a kind of removed, clinical attention, the attention she brought to the work, turned briefly on herself. Her hands were steady. After everything that had happened in the last 90 minutes in the formal sitting room of a house she had been cleaning for 4 years, her hands were completely steady. She worked. At 1:15, Mr. Aldrich appeared in the doorway. He came in without ceremony and stood at the work table and looked at her progress and said nothing for a moment because he was a man who understood that the works spoke before anything else did. How much left, he said. 2 hours, maybe less. He nodded. Then I heard the front door. He came with a lawyer. I know. Vivienne called me. He was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? She ran the needle through and considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I have a meeting at 4 o'clock, she said. I'd like to be done with this seam before then. He almost smiled. That's not what I asked. I know. She looked up at him. I'm all right. I've been in rooms like that before. Smaller rooms. Same dynamic. She looked back at the silk. I know how to stand in them. He was quiet again. Diana Reeves is serious, he said, about the position. I've known her for 20 years. She doesn't make calls. She doesn't mean. I know. The work you've done here. He stopped. Looked at the gown with the expression of someone for whom beauty and craft is not a sentimental matter, but a precise one. I've seen restoration work from people who trained at houses in Paris and Milan and London. I mean that without exaggeration. Amara looked at the gown. At the seam, she had spent 5 days rebuilding from the inside out. At the lion silk, that showed no trace of what had almost destroyed it. At the structure underneath, rerouted, reinforced, load-bearing, in a way it had never been before the failure point was found and fixed. Marguerite told me once, she said that the best restoration work is the work where you can't tell anything was ever wrong. She paused. She said the job is not to show what you fixed. The job is to make people believe it was always right. She looked at Mr. Aldrich. I've been making people believe things were always right for 15 years, she said. It's time to let them see the work. He nodded. A single, clean nod. He left. She worked. At 3:40, she tied off the final stitch and sat back and looked at the gown. It was finished. The seam was invisible. The silk was seamless. The structural repair existed only in the knowledge of the two people who had worked on it herself, and Mr. Aldrich, and in the physical reality of the gown itself, which was now stronger at its former failure point than it had been anywhere else. She took off the magnifying glasses. She stood up. She stretched her back, which had been in the same position for most of the day. She walked around the dress form and looked at the gown from 3 angles, finding the seam each time with her eyes, watching it disappear, the way a well-done thing always disappears into its own correctness. She picked up her bag. She looked at the gown one last time. Then she walked out of the sewing room and down the main staircase, not the back stairs. The main ones, the ones she had never used in 4 years, because those were the stairs for the family. And she walked through the foyer, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway, where Celeste and Vivienne were sitting at the kitchen table, with cups of tea and the particular quiet exhaustion of a household that has survived a morning. "The gown is finished," Amara said. They both looked at her. "If either of you wants to see it, it's on the dress form in the sewing room." She paused. "It's ready. For whatever it's needed for." Celeste stood. "Where are you going?" she asked. Amara looked at her. At this woman who had pointed across a room at her 3 weeks ago and said something that was supposed to diminish her, and had instead cracked everything open: the room, the house, the careful invisible life, the box under the winter coats, everything. "I have a meeting," Amara said. She walked out of the kitchen. She walked through the back hall. She put on her coat. And she opened the kitchen door and walked out into the afternoon light of Charleston, with her needle kit in her bag and 15 years of buried work rising in her hands, like something that had never actually stopped. The address on King Street was 12 minutes away. She walked. King Street in the early afternoon had the particular quality of a city that doesn't know it's being watched. The shops were open. People moved past with the ordinary purpose of people who had ordinary things to do. A woman with a stroller. 2 men in suits talking without looking at each other. A teenager on a phone, walking and not seeing anything. Amara walked through all of it and felt none of it touching her. She was in the strange, pressurized calm that follows a morning like the one she'd had. The calm that isn't peace, but is the body's negotiation with the fact that it has run very hard and must now present itself as though it hasn't. Her back was tight from 5 days of close work. Her eyes were tired in the specific way that comes from hours of magnified focus. And underneath all of it, moving like a current she could feel, but couldn't quite see the surface of, was the knowledge that what she was walking toward in the next 12 minutes was not just a meeting. It was the thing that came after a door. She had stood at doors before. She knew what they cost. Bellamy Atelier was on the quieter end of King Street, set back slightly from the sidewalk, behind a facade that was deliberately understated, a narrow storefront with a dark green awning and a single window display that held exactly one gown on exactly one form, lit from above with the precision of something in a museum. The gown in the window was ivory silk, structured through the bodice, with a skirt that moved in the air conditioning draft in a way that made it look alive. Amara stopped on the sidewalk outside and looked at it for a moment. She recognized the construction. Mid-century silhouette with contemporary reinforcing. Someone who knew both traditions and had made a deliberate choice about which elements to honor. Good work. Serious work. She looked at it the way she'd been trained to look at things for what it told her, not for how it made her feel. Then she pushed the door open and went in. The interior was what she'd expected, and also more than she'd expected: a long room with pale walls and very good lighting, bolts of fabric organized by weight and color. Along one side, a row of dress forms in various states of preparation, and at the far end, a desk where a woman was standing rather than sitting, looking at something on a large work table, spread with pattern pieces. Diana Reeves was in her mid-50s, small and precise in the way of people who have spent decades doing work that requires physical accuracy. Her hair was silver, cut close. She wore a linen shirt and trousers, and reading glasses pushed up on her head that she'd clearly forgotten were there. She looked up when Amara came in, and her expression did the thing that Amara had learned to read over the years: the rapid, professional assessment, the recalibration, and then the settling into something that was genuine attention. "Miss Ellison," she said. She came around the work table with her hand extended. "Diana Reeves, thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who had things to do. "Thank you for calling," Amara said. Diana gestured to the chairs at the near end of the work table, real chairs, not the performative kind. Amara sat across from her. I want to be direct with you, Diana said, because I find it's the most efficient way to do anything, and also the most respectful. She folded her hands on the table. I spoke with Gerald Aldrich for 40 minutes yesterday afternoon. He described what he observed over 5 days of working alongside you on the Harrington gown. He described your diagnostic process, your technical decisions on the seam reinforcement, your approach to the surface restoration on the Lyon silk. She paused. He told me you identified a catastrophic structural failure under passive examination from across a room. I was close, Amara said. Not across the room. He said you'd say that. The corner of Diana's mouth moved. I've known Gerald for 22 years. He is not a person who overstates things. He is famously, sometimes irritatingly, precise in his assessments. She looked at Amara. He used the word extraordinary 3 times in 40 minutes. I counted. Amara looked at her hands on the table. At the hands that had been holding a needle 6 hours ago, and before that had been still in a room with a lawyer making claims about her character, and before that had been running thread through silk in the early morning quiet of a sewing room in someone else's house. Tell me about the position, she said. Diana nodded. She opened a folder on the table, actual paper, which Amara found she respected. We have 3 core service areas, Diana said. New construction, which is bridal primarily, alteration and fitting, which is our largest volume operation, and restoration, which is the area we're speaking about today. She turned a page. Restoration at this level is specialized. I don't mean dry cleaning a vintage piece or replacing a zipper. I mean couture restoration, historical garments, structurally compromised pieces, work that requires both diagnostic skill and construction knowledge at the highest level. She looked up. We've been without a senior restoration specialist for 14 months. The woman who held this role before Eleanor Park, who trained in Tokyo under a preservation house, retired and moved to be near her grandchildren. She was with us for 11 years. A pause. We have not found anyone in 14 months of looking who can do what she did. Until Gerald called you, Amara said. Until Gerald called me. Diana closed the folder. I want to see your work before we go further. That's standard. I'd need to assess your technique directly, not through description. She paused. But I want to be transparent about something first. The position I'm describing, the compensation, the scope, the professional standing it, requires a commitment, not just technical. It requires someone who can represent this house to clients who come here with very old, very valuable, sometimes irreplaceable garments, and are trusting us with things that matter to them in ways beyond money. She looked at Amara steadily. That requires a particular quality of person, not just skill, character. Amara met her eyes. Gerald described, Diana said carefully, some of the circumstances around your work on the Harrington gown. Not in detail. Enough. She paused. He said that you identified the structural failure, disclosed it, when you could have said nothing. Yes. Why? Amara thought about the question. Not performing the thinking, actually thinking, because it deserved a real answer. Because the dress was going to fail, she said, in front of 400 people, and I could see it, and nobody else in the room could, and withholding that information would have been a different kind of failure. She paused. Not a structural one, but a failure. Diana looked at her for a long moment. The position is yours if you want it, she said, contingent on the technical assessment, which I don't anticipate being a problem based on what Gerald described. She named a salary. Amara kept her face still. The number was more than 3 times what she made at the Harrington estate. It was more than she had made at any point in her professional life, including the New York years. It was the kind of number that changed the calculation on the specialist appointment and the rent and the cold bus and the early mornings and everything she'd been running on the back of her mind for 15 years. She kept her face still because this was not the moment for anything but clarity. When would you need an answer? She said. End of the week, Diana said. We have a commission coming in a 1940s bias-cut satin that needs immediate assessment. I'd want you to look at it as part of the evaluation. She paused. But Miss Ellison, Amara, I want to say something else. She leaned forward slightly. I've been running this house for 22 years. I've hired people with impeccable credentials who couldn't do the work, and people with no credentials at all who could do it beautifully. What I've learned is that the training matters, but it doesn't tell the whole story. She looked at her directly. Gerald told me that you've been working as a housekeeper for 4 years. That before that, you spent several years as a primary caregiver for a family member. That you left a promising career to do both of those things. She paused. I want you to know that none of that is a mark against you in this room. In this room, those 15 years are evidence of something. She held Amara's gaze. The technique doesn't degrade. Not in hands like yours. What those years are evidence of is that you made hard choices, and you survived them, and you're still here. That's not a gap in your resume. That's your resume. The room was very quiet. Outside on King Street, the ordinary afternoon continued its ordinary business. Somewhere a delivery truck was doing something. A bell above a door somewhere down the block. Amara looked at Diana Reeves and felt, for the first time in 15 years, the specific sensation of being seen by someone who was looking for exactly what she was. End of the week, she said. You'll have my answer, sir. She walked back to the Harrington estate because she needed the air and the time, and because 12 minutes of walking was 12 minutes of being inside her own head without anyone else's needs in it. She thought about Destiny, about calling the specialist tonight, about the way Destiny narrated her own dreams out loud and had her father's nose, and would one day perhaps want to know what her mother's hands were for. She thought about the box under the winter coats, about Marguerite Fontenot's letter, about the needle kit wrapped in tissue paper that had been waiting in the dark for 15 years and had come out last week and gone to work as though no time had passed at all. She thought about the dress. She was still thinking about the dress when she came through the kitchen entrance and found Celeste sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and her phone, face down, beside it, and a look on her face that was the particular look of someone who has been waiting for a person to come back. How did it go? Celeste asked. Amara took off her coat, hung it on the hook. It went well, she said. Celeste studied her. That's not all of it. No, Amara agreed. It's not. She sat down at the kitchen table the second time in the history of her employment here that she had sat at this table rather than stood beside it or cleaned around it. She offered me the position. Celeste was still. Senior Restoration Specialist. Yes. A beat. Are you going to take it? I think so. Amara looked at her hands on the table. I needed to sit with it for a moment before I was sure. Celeste was quiet for a little while. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was doing its late afternoon thing, the light changing angle, the shadows lengthening across the path that led to the back gate. Amara had swept that path approximately 400 times. I called Laurel Foss, Celeste said, the journalist, after you left this morning. Amara looked at her. I told her the story, Celeste said. Not the whole story, the shape of it, the fitting room, the dress, what you found, who you are, she paused. She wants to do the profile, a full feature. She wants to photograph your work on the gown before it leaves the house. She met Amaza's eyes. I told her she needed your permission, that it was your story and your decision. It is, Amara said. I know, Celeste held her gaze. I wanted you to know I didn't go ahead without asking you this time. The words landed quietly. Amara let them land. What would the article say? She said. What's true, Celeste said. That a woman with 15 years of couture training was working as a housekeeper because life didn't leave her any other viable option, and that a dress brought her back to her work. She paused, and that she was the only person in a room full of people who could see what was wrong. Amara looked at the cold tea in Celeste's cup. How are you? She asked. Not about the article. About the morning. About Preston and the lawyer and the ring that was no longer on her hand. Celeste looked at her with an expression that was layered in a way that would take longer than an afternoon to fully read. Terrible, she said. She stopped. Found the word. Cleaner. I feel cleaner than I have in a long time. That's the hardest kind of feeling, Amara said. The ones that are two things at once. Yes. Celeste turned the cold cup in her hands. He called this afternoon. After Fitch left. He said he wanted to talk without lawyers. He said he still loved me. She paused. I told him that wasn't the question I was trying to answer anymore. What is the question? Celeste looked up. Whether I loved myself enough to stop making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. She said it simply, without drama. The way you say a thing, you've only just understood, but that is already undeniable. I've been doing that for a long time. With him. She looked around the kitchen, with a lot of things. Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. My mother wants to have dinner tonight, Celeste said. The three of us. She asked specifically. She looked at Amara. She said she has been running this house for 26 years, and she has never once had a meal with the woman who keeps it running, and she would like to correct that. Amara looked at her for a moment. I need to check on my daughter first, she said. Of course. She called Mrs. Reyes. Destiny's fever was down to 98.1. She'd eaten soup and was watching television, and had asked 3 times when her mother was coming home. Amara told Mrs. Reyes she'd be home by 8 and asked if she could stay, and Mrs. Reyes said yes, because Mrs. Reyes was one of the people who made the world function. She called the pediatric specialist's office. She made an appointment for the following Thursday. She read the copay from the insurance portal and did not do the calculation about rent. She scheduled it. Then she went upstairs to the sewing room one last time. The gown was on the dress form where she'd left it. In the late afternoon light, the crimson silk was something different than it was at any other hour, deeper, more interior, like a color that had been waiting for this specific quality of light to show what it actually was. She stood in front of it. She'd been looking at it for 5 days, and this was the first time she'd looked at it without the magnifying glasses, without the needle, without the specific professional attention of restoration work. This was just looking. The way you look at something that is finished. It was extraordinary. The original designer, whoever they were, had built something genuinely rare. A garment with an internal logic so coherent that even its failure point had failed elegantly, in a direction that the design itself almost predicted. And now that logic was complete. The seam she'd rebuilt was the strongest junction in the entire construction. If this gown lasted another 100 years, that seam would be the last thing to go. She put her hand on it, very lightly. Just the fingertips. On the side seam she'd spent 5 days rebuilding. She felt through the silk, the work underneath. Her work. She took her hand away. She picked up her bag and her needle kit, and she left the sewing room, and she did not look back. Dinner in the Harrington dining room was not what she had expected, which was probably because she hadn't let herself expect anything specific. She had come back at 6:30, and Vivienne had been in the kitchen doing something she clearly didn't do very often, attempting to heat a pot of soup that had been delivered from somewhere, and managing it with the focused determination of a woman who was not going to ask for help with a pot of soup. Amara had taken over without comment. Vivienne had let her, without comment. The 6, they had worked side by side in the kitchen for 20 minutes, and neither of them had said anything significant, and that had been, in its own way, more significant than anything that could have been said. Celeste had set the table in the smaller dining room, not the formal one, the one with the long table that seated 16, the everyday one, with 3 places set with care but not ceremony. They sat down. The soup was chicken and white bean, and it was good not from the cooking. Amara hadn't done much to it, but from whatever it had been before it arrived. They ate. Vivienne poured water for everyone, and then wine for herself and Celeste, and looked at Amara and said, "Unless you'd rather not." And Amara said she'd have a small glass, and Vivienne poured it. It was the first time in 4 years that Amara had sat at a table where the wine was poured for her. She noted it without drama. Filed it alongside the main staircase, which she'd used for the first time that morning. "Laurel Foss is good," Vivienne said. It came out of a silence, but not an uncomfortable one. The silence before it had been the silence of people eating together, which is its own kind of communication. Amara looked at her. The profile Vivienne clarified. Celeste told me she called her. Laurel's writing is, she's the kind of journalist who makes you feel like the subject of her story is the only person in the world worth writing about. She paused. Which is a skill, if I say yes, Amara said. Of course, Vivienne held her gaze. If you say yes. Celeste was looking at the table, moving a piece of bread between her hands. I owe you an apology, Vivienne said. That is not a qualified apology, not an explanation wearing an apology's clothing. A real one. She set down her wine glass. 4 years. I hired you, I paid you fairly, I treated you. She stopped. I treated you as the function you served in this house, not as the person you are. I told myself that was professional, that it was the appropriate relationship. She pressed her lips together. I knew your shoe size from the cleaning supply orders before I knew your daughter's name. The table was quiet, Vivienne, Amara said. Let me finish, Vivienne said, not harshly, firmly. I've been running this house the way I run everything, with management. Control. Distance between categories of people. She exhaled. My husband used to say that I organized the world, because the world organized itself in ways that frightened me. He was right. He was usually right about those things. She looked at the wine in her glass. He died before he could meet Amara Ellison, and I think he would have had a great deal to say about the fact that she was in this house for 4 years, and I never once asked what she was doing before she came here. The table was very still. He sounds like he was a good person, Amara said. He was complicated, Vivienne said, which was the truest thing you could say about anyone. But yes, underneath the complicated, he was good. She looked at Amara. I'm sorry, for 4 years of not asking. Amara sat with it. The apology and the 4 years and the shoe size and the soup and the main staircase and all of it. Thank you, she said, for saying it. Not forgiveness exactly, not the erasure of 4 years, but something honest, given and received by 2 women sitting at a table together over soup, which was more than most reckonings managed. Celeste looked up from the bread she'd been destroying quietly. Her eyes were wet, but not spilling the Harrington composure, even now. I want to tell you something, she said to Amara, and I need you to hear it without arguing with me. All right. I want to fund the first 3 months of studio space, Celeste said. When you're ready. When you have the position at Bellamy and you've been there long enough to know what you need and where you want to go. She held up a hand. Amara had started to speak. Not charity. A loan with no interest and no timeline. You pay it back when you can, or you don't. And if you don't, we call it what it actually is, which is the least I can do with money I have too much of for something that matters. She looked at her. You told me this morning that a piece of work deserves to be whole, regardless of whether the circumstances change. I'm telling you the same thing about your career. It deserves to be whole, and I have the means to help make that happen. And I'm asking you to let me. Amara looked at her. At this woman, who 3 weeks ago had never known her last name, who had pointed across a room full of people and used her body as a punchline, who had, in the aftermath of that moment, done the thing that was considerably rarer and harder than cruelty. She had looked at what she'd done and refused to look away from it. I'll think about it, Amara said, which was what she'd said before. But this time the texture of it was different, less like a door being held mostly shut and more like one that was open a few inches, enough to see light through. Celeste nodded. They finished dinner. It was Vivienne who suggested without preamble as they were clearing the table together, all 3 of them, in the kitchen, the way people clear tables in houses where the work is shared, that the gown should stay where it was until Amara decided what she wanted to do about the article. It's still your work, Vivienne said. Until you say otherwise, it stays. Amara thought about the gown on the dress form upstairs. The crimson silk and the invisible seam and the late afternoon light. I'll give you an answer by Thursday, she said. She called a car to take her home the first time she'd done that rather than taking the bus, and she registered the small strangeness of it. The way new things always feel slightly wrong at the edges before they feel normal. She got home at 8:15. Destiny was awake, barely on the couch again, but deliberately this time, in her pajamas waiting. She scrambled up when Amara came in, and Amara caught her without thinking, the automatic catch of a parent who has been catching this particular weight for 9 years. You were late, Destiny said into her shoulder. I know. I'm sorry. Mrs. Reyes made me soup. Was it good? It was okay. A pause. She puts too much pepper. I'll tell her. Destiny pulled back and looked at her mother with the disconcerting directness of a 9-year-old who had inherited her mother's instincts and hadn't yet learned to soften them. Did something good happen today? She asked. Amara looked at her daughter, at the fever-flushed cheeks that were looking better, at the braids that were entirely destroyed now, at the absolute, specific, irreplaceable fact of this child in her arms. Something might be starting, she said carefully. Destiny considered this. That's not the same as good. No, Amara agreed. But it's better than nothing. And sometimes better than nothing is how everything starts. Destiny thought about this with the gravity she brought to things that mattered to her. Okay, she said. That's okay. She carried Destiny to bed, tucked her in, sat on the edge of the mattress. The cough was lighter tonight, almost gone. The specialist appointment was Thursday. The rent was where it was, but it was managed. Things were where they were. She sat for a while in the quiet of her daughter's room. Then she went to her own closet, and she pulled out the box from under the winter coats. She didn't open it. She just set it on the floor beside her bed, where she could see it. Where it was out, in the open, not underneath anything. She lay down. She thought about Diana Reeves sitting across a work table, saying that's not a gap in your resume. That's your resume. She thought about Mr. Aldrich making a phone call without telling her, the quiet, decisive act of a craftsman who recognized something worth preserving and acted on it. She thought about Vivian in the kitchen, handling a pot of soup with the fierce concentration of a woman learning something new at 61. She thought about Celeste standing in the sitting room this morning with her back straight and her voice certain, saying, "That is how he thinks, and I am done being managed." She thought about the gown, about the seam she'd found with her fingers in a room full of people who hadn't seen it, about the 5 days of rebuilding it from the inside, about the fact that when you do that kind of work properly, when you really do it, you can't tell where the damage was. You can only tell, if you know how to look, that it's stronger than it was before. She reached over and turned off the light. In the dark, the box sat on the floor beside her bed, not under anything, not hidden, just there where she could reach it. 3 weeks later, the article ran in Southern Couture. Laurel Foss had done what Vivian said she did. She'd written it as if Amara Ellison were the only person in the world worth writing about, which was not because she was the only person, but because that was what it took to tell a story properly. It ran with photographs, a portrait of Amara at the work table in the Bellamy atelier, her magnifying glasses on, a needle in her hand, the particular focused expression of someone doing work they were made to do. And alongside it, a detailed photograph of the restored seam in the crimson gown. Just the seam, shot close, the silk seamless and perfect, and giving nothing away about what had been wrong or what it had taken to make it right. The caption under the seam photograph was a line from the article, quoted from Amara herself, when Laurel had asked her what restoration work was really about. The job is not to show what you fixed. The job is to make people believe it was always right. Destiny read the article on a Thursday morning, sitting at the kitchen table before school, her braids freshly done, her cough entirely gone, 2 days after the specialist appointment, her small finger tracing the lines of text with the careful attention of a child, encountering something she understands is important. When she finished, she looked up at her mother. "They took a picture of your hands," she said. "They did." Destiny looked at the photograph, at the hands with the needle, at the work. "I like your hands," she said. Amara sat down across from her daughter at the kitchen table and looked at her at 9 years old, and the braids and the father's nose and the mother's stubbornness. Stubborns and the imagination so vivid she narrated her dreams out loud. "Me too," she said. "I'm starting to like them again." Destiny nodded seriously. Then she finished her toast and picked up her backpack and headed for the door. At the door she stopped. "Mama," she said. "Yeah, the people who laughed at you." She said it with the directness of someone who had read the article, understood what it said between the lines even at 9 years old. "Do they feel bad now?" Amara thought about Celeste standing up from the settee, thought about Vivian in the kitchens with the soup, thought about 47 people in a fitting room and the silence that had followed 3 words. "I'll try it on," and everything that had come after. Some of them do," she said, "and some of them will need more time, and some of them won't, ever." She paused. "But none of that is the part that matters." Destiny looked at her. "What's the part that matters?" Amara looked at her daughter in the doorway. The morning light behind her, the backpack over one shoulder, the whole long, ordinary, extraordinary day waiting on the other side of that door. "That I'm still here," she said. "That I didn't let them make me small enough to fit into a story where I didn't belong." Destiny thought about it. Then she said, "Okay," the way she always said okay, when a thing had landed as in settled and become hers to keep. She went to school. Amara sat alone at the kitchen table for a moment, in the quiet of a morning that was hers, in an apartment that was home, with a meeting at Bellamy at 9 and a 1940s bias-cut satin waiting to be assessed, and a box that was no longer under anything. She drank her coffee. She looked at her hands. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went to work.